Thank you, Gabor, and thank you to our host, and thank you to the people who are here to listen. My topic is the birth of socialism out of the war, out of the Great War. Which is where socialism was born in 1917. It had been conceived in the French Revolution, but then the gestation period lasted for more than 120 years. The images of socialism had been sketched by philosophers as far back as Plato. But these had never been more than intellectual exercises designed to make observations about society or to criticize current societies. And it was not until the French Revolution that people got the idea that through dramatic political action they could really make the world new according to their own lights. And initially, the French Revolution was not socialist. The various revolutionary doctrines strongly affirmed the right of property, but the revolutionary documents also added the right of equality as an essential purpose of government, to create equality. Much that the French did had been borrowed from the American Revolution, and the Americans did speak of all men are created equal, but that was more of a philosophical statement. The French did something different, making equality an essential purpose of government. Late in the Revolution, though, some radicals observed that there was a contradiction between the pursuit of equality and the right of property, and therefore property had to go. This was a small band of revolutionaries led by a man who called himself Gracchus Babeuf, who created a group called the Conspiracy of Equals. And they argued that to have equality, there must be, rather than a right of private property, no property at all, except that all material goods must be shared with exact equality. In fact, they argued that no person should have more of any material good than any other person, and no person should have any more knowledge than of any other person. How they were going to accomplish that was not clear, but they attempted a coup in the last days of the revolution, and they were thwarted, and their plans were destroyed, and Babeuf ended on the guillotine, and that put an end to the first chapter in the gestation of socialism. The second chapter was written in the first half of the 19th century by a group of visionaries who had an idea of, or different ideas, but with a common thought of society should be based on sharing and equality. These were men like Robert Owen of England and Charles Fourier of France. But they were not revolutionaries, they were not political activists. Rather, they thought that they could create communities based on their ideas, and in that way demonstrate to the world what a better way to live this would be. And so communes were created. Over the 19th century, there were as many as 300 of these communes, And although the thinkers were Europeans, most of the communes were set up in the United States, where it was easy to get land and there were very few social inhibitions. Now, perhaps half of these communes had a religious basis, and these communes were not primarily interested in socialism. They were primarily interested in creating a community of worship, but sharing property was part of that worship, and many of these communes were quite successful, some lasted more than a century. But the other communes were created by socialists just for the purpose of practicing socialism and demonstrating what a fine way of life it would be. And those communes were a complete failure. They fell apart very quickly. The average lifespan of the socialist communes was 2 years. And these thinkers were really quite fanciful people. Owen unveiled what he called the Declaration of Mental Independence, in which he argued that the world had been enthralled to what he called 3 monstrous evils: private property, religion, and marriage. And while he was fanciful, Fourier was even more fanciful, who proposed that work could be done away with, at least work by human beings, because all the work that was currently done could be done by lions and whales if they were properly trained. Fourier also said that people ought to be guaranteed material goods and what he called a social minimum, but this was not enough. Everyone also ought to be guaranteed a sexual minimum so that everyone could enjoy fulfillment beyond their mere material needs. But for all this fancy, these communes were a failure. And if the story of socialism might well have ended right there after this, with an aborted pregnancy after 50 years, but the idea was then rescued, and it was rescued by the most powerful and fantastic secular prophet that there's ever been, Karl Marx. Marx was very well aware of the failure of these communes. Engels had developed a close relationship with Owen and went to his meetings and heard his lectures. But he pulled one of the greatest intellectual tricks that I know, which was Marx dismissed all these failures as utopianism. And he said, well, that's just utopian, but I have discovered scientific socialism. And I say this was a great conjuring trick, because what is science? Well, the essence of science, as I understand it, is experimentation. So we had Owen and Fourier and the like. They had this idea of a better society, and what did they do? They set up experiments to test their ideas. The experiments failed, but they were the real scientific socialists. Marx comes along and says, never mind anything empirical. I have a vision of the future, and I can see that even if no one else can, that in the future there will be socialism. And this he called scientific socialism, but really it was pure prophecy. The Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm said, quote, it was not until Marx transferred the center of gravity of the argument for socialism from its rationality or desirability to its historic inevitability that socialism acquired its most formidable intellectual weapon, But this was not an intellectual weapon at all. It was a psychological weapon. There was nothing with any intellectual weight in it, but it made socialism somehow so much more attractive to know that this is what the future wanted. And so Marx rescued the socialist idea for another half a century, let us say. But then, after about a half a century, the most important Marxist intellectual, the intellectual heir to Marx and Engels, Edward Bernstein, observed that the prophecy was not coming true. According to the prophecy, the workers were going to get poorer and poorer, which would lead them to make the socialist revolution. But Bernstein observed that A, the workers were not showing any signs of making a revolution, and B, they were not growing poorer. In fact, their standard of living was improving across the board. And so he made a simple inference. He said, for me, the movement is everything, and the final goal is nothing. By which he meant, I would like to continue to help the workers to get a better standard of living, but I'm going to give up the idea of a kind of magical leap to a whole new kind of society. For this heresy, Bernstein was violently attacked by Kautsky, Luxemburg, and others, but especially by Lenin, who was apoplectic when he read what Bernstein had to say. Of course, Lenin was apoplectic a great deal of the time. That was sort of his common mode of being. He was angry in particular because he saw the same thing that Bernstein saw, that the workers were not making the revolution. So you had in Marxism these two essential pillars, the workers and the revolution. And they were supposedly entwined, but they were not entwined. And so, in effect, you had to make a choice. So Bernstein said he would stick with the workers and forget about the revolution. Lenin made the opposite choice. The revolution was everything, and forget about the workers, but not exactly. Instead, because he insisted that he was the most pure Marxist, he said he had discovered a new proletariat that was more proletarian than the proletariat, and this was the professional revolutionaries, and a group of them that he led. And he didn't merely say that the professional revolutionaries would somehow make the revolution for the workers or in behalf of the workers. He said that somehow, mystically, magically, the professional revolutionaries were the proletariat, even though none of them were proletarians. It was a kind of transubstantiation. And it worked. He managed to seize power. He seized power in Russia, which was falling apart under the weight of war. They called it a revolution, but it was really a putsch with a relatively small number of armed followers. As one historian put it, Lenin seized power not in a country that was ripe for socialism, but a country that was ripe for seizing power. And Lenin himself said power was in the streets, and picking it up was as easy as picking up a feather. And in many ways, the Marxist theory had by now been destroyed. It was destroyed in the sense of what Bernstein saw, that the workers, and what Lenin saw too, that the workers were not becoming revolutionary as they were supposed to do. It was destroyed again in 1914, when the central idea of Marxism was that class is the most important variable. The working man has no country, he said. But when war broke out in 1914, the working men in every country of Europe swelled with patriotism and flocked to the flags of their country. And yet, even though logically Marxism was destroyed, in fact, it seemed to be vindicated, because the most important thing about Marxism psychologically was that it was a prophecy. And this seemed to be vindicated. Suddenly, socialism was here in the biggest country in Europe. And so the idea that history had a direction with capitalism at its back and socialism before its eyes as its future, that seemed to be vindicated. And the result was the beginning of a tremendous spread of socialism in various forms around the world. Everywhere in the world, communist parties were created to try to imitate directly what Lenin did and to take orders from Lenin and his heirs about what to do. None of these communist parties ever won an election, but over the coming decades in a variety of countries, they came to power by means of violence until about 60 or so years after Lenin's putsch, something like 30% of the people in the world were living under communist governments. But it was not only Lenin's direct imitators. There were in every country, more or less, socialist parties, and there were socialists who rejected what Lenin had done as too violent and too dictatorial. And they had the labor parties, social democratic parties, sometimes called socialist parties, in the various countries. And these parties had been weakened by the defection of those who went to join the newfound communist parties. But still, over these same decades, they had success like never before, because they were encouraged and energized and given credibility by this sense that Marx's prophecy was vindicated. Socialism was the future. And even if Russia had the wrong kind of socialism, we in our country will build the right kind of socialism, and it will be beautiful and peaceful. And these parties also flourished. And then in addition to these two, there were other kinds of socialism. Briefly, there was fascism and National Socialism. Mussolini was a keen student of Lenin's, and he still spoke in Marxist terminology. He substituted class, nation for class, but he said Marxistically that Italy, a poor country, is the proletariat of nations, and therefore the rise of Italy is sort of the equivalent of, in the classical theory, the rise of the workers. But that kind of socialism, of fascism and nationalist socialism, was for a moment very successful. In fact, in the countries where it took power, it was more popular than communism ever was in the countries where it took power. But it was quickly destroyed in the war that the fascists themselves created. After the war, there was yet a new kind of socialism born in all of the newborn countries that had been the colonies of Europe, that is in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, new countries that practiced things called African socialism, Arab socialism, and other things of that kind. This third world socialism was some kind of melange of socialism, communism, fascism. It was encouraged officially by the UN as the way for new countries to get rich. In fact, it kept them poor for a generation. But by some point in the 1970s or 80s, 60 or 70 years after socialism was born, you could look around the world and see that more than 60% of mankind was living under governments that called themselves socialists, whether third world, communist, social democratic, what have you. Never has any big idea, not even the great religions, spread so far and so fast. And then, stunningly, in the very last years of the 20th century, it all fell apart, but not before doing immense damage to the world, claiming scores of millions of lives and blighting even more, keeping the developing countries poor and more and worse. It was one of history's most amazing and most tragic stories. Thank you.